Crescent Bay was the kind of coastal town that looked like it had been painted by memory. The harbor's wooden piers creaked under the weight of seagulls, and the boats swayed gently in the Atlantic breeze, like they too had grown tired of waiting. In late summer of 1993, the town's rhythm was as steady as the tide. Among the locals, no one was more known or respected than Caleb Foster. A fisherman since he was 16, Caleb had saltwater in his blood and an uncanny sense for reading the sea. He was a quiet man devoted to his wife Nora and his aging dog Buster. That August morning, he kissed Nora's cheek, packed his thermos of coffee, and headed down to Dock C with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. By sundown, the boat was missing and Caleb was gone. Nora had waited by the radio longer than she'd like to admit. She'd grown used to the unpredictability of the ocean and the way it sometimes held men a little longer than promised. But something in her gut felt different that night. She called the harbor patrol at midnight. The next morning, a rescue team located Caleb's floating cooler near Beacon Rock, 30 miles from his original fishing route. There was no sign of struggle, no wreckage. The Coast Guard did a sweep, but they came up with nothing but open water and silence. It was as if the boat and its captain had slipped between the seams of reality. The search dragged on for weeks, and Crescent Bay began to lean into its own conclusions. Some whispered it was an accident, that maybe Caleb had a heart attack or slipped overboard. Others said it was suicide, though that theory felt wrong to anyone who had ever spoken to him. He had recently repainted the boat, talked about repairing the kitchen floor, even helped his neighbor fix a broken fence just the week before. He was, by all accounts, planning for the future. But plans have a strange way of crumbling when the sea is involved. By late September, the official report labeled Caleb as missing and presumed dead. The town mourned him the way it mourned the old cannery that had burned down years earlier quietly, almost reverently. Nora did not mourn. Not in the way people expected. She didn't wear black or hold vigils. Instead, she sat by the harbor every morning with a cup of coffee, the same way Caleb used to watching the boats leave and return. She refused to sign any insurance paperwork or change the locks on their front door. She kept Caleb's coat hanging by the back porch, brushed Buster's fur daily, and read aloud to the dog each evening like she used to do when Caleb came home late. People began to murmur. They called it denial, some called it devotion. Nora called it waiting. Then something strange happened. A month after the Coast Guard called off the search, a farmer named Neil Garrow discovered a cracked plastic casing while cleaning out an old barn on the far edge of the county. Inside was a corroded emergency beacon. Its registration code, still legible, CF 2193, Caleb Foster's. The barn was 35 miles inland, tucked behind a collapsed grain silo, and sealed for over a decade. There was no logical explanation for how the device had gotten there, and no evidence that Caleb had ever visited that area. The authorities took the beacon in for testing, found salt residue, and eventually returned it to Nora without offering much else. 2 weeks later, a jogger found a dog wet shivering and covered in sand on the side of the Highway 12. It was Buster, the same Buster who had vanished the day Caleb went missing, the same Buster Nora assumed had drowned or wandered into the woods to die. He was gaunt, his nails cracked, and patches of fur were missing, but he was alive. The vet said he had ingested seawater. No one could explain how he had made it that far inland or why his paws were torn up like he had walked for miles across gravel and asphalt. Buster slept for 2 days straight after Nora brought him home, curling up beneath Caleb's favorite chair. Rumors reignited across Crescent Bay. A man does not disappear at sea only to have his emergency beacon show up inland, and his dog reappear weeks later, looking like it had just come ashore. Questions floated around like flotsam, but no answers ever surfaced. The town slowly returned to its routines. Fishing quotas came and festivals were held, and new faces moved into old houses. But for Nora, time split cleanly in two, before Caleb vanished and after. She clung to small routines like they were lifelines. Every Sunday she made pancakes for one. Every first of the month she mailed a letter to the Coast Guard's cold case department. And every night she dreamt of the sea. One evening, as autumn turned the leaves brittle and the wind gained teeth, Nora walked down to the dock just as the sun bled into the water. A young boy was fishing off the edge, his shoes too big and his line tangled. Nora helped him sort it out, taught him how to cast. He asked if her husband was one of the fishermen. She paused, unsure of how to answer. Eventually, she just nodded and sat beside him in silence. When the boy's father arrived and thanked her, Nora stood and turned to leave. Before she walked away, the boy handed her a small stone he'd found in the water. It was smooth and white-shaped like a teardrop. She took it home, placed it on Caleb's empty nightstand, and whispered goodnight to no one. Somewhere beyond Crescent Bay, the sea held its secrets, and the winds carried whispers in a language only the waves understood. But Nora was listening. She'd always been listening, and something deep inside her told her the story wasn't over yet. Weeks turned to months, and Crescent Bay turned its attention elsewhere. The town's collective memory was short, especially when it came to things that made people uneasy. Nora, however, could not forget. The reappearance of the emergency beacon and the mysterious return of Buster gnawed at her. These were not coincidences. She found herself walking further each day, tracing the shoreline, studying maps she had not looked at since her school days. She began recording the tides, marking the positions of the buoys, and reading weather logs from the week Caleb vanished. Her evenings were filled with notepads and highlighters. The neighbors began to avoid eye contact when they passed her house, offering tight smiles and even tighter silences. They whispered that she had become obsessed, that grief had turned her strange. But Nora did not care what they said. She felt something alive beneath the details, like a thread buried under dust waiting to be pulled. Late one Thursday evening, Nora returned from the harbor with something unusual. Caleb's storage locker, which she had asked the harbor master to seal after his disappearance, had been opened. She had the only key, yet the lock had been changed. She insisted on seeing inside. The manager, sympathetic yet skeptical, accompanied her. The locker was nearly empty except for a small wooden crate that had not been there before. Inside it was an old nautical map and a folded piece of paper with a note that simply said, "Follow the rocks." Nora did not recognize the handwriting, but something about the message felt urgent. The map, though worn, was labeled with landmarks she knew well. One route had been circled in red, leading toward a jagged part of the coastline known by locals as the Teeth. It was a place of sharp cliffs and unpredictable tides avoided by even the most experienced fishermen. Nora took the map home and spread it across the kitchen table. She compared it with her modern charts and noticed that the circled route cut directly through a small inlet, now considered inaccessible. She stared at it for hours, her tea growing cold beside her. The note echoed in her mind like a bell in fog. The next morning she packed a lunch, filled her thermos, and drove north until the road narrowed into gravel. From there, she walked the last mile toward the Teeth. It had been years since she had made this hike, and her legs ached before she even reached the overlook. But when she stood there gazing down at the dark waters crashing against the rocks below, she felt no fear, only clarity. Something had brought her here, and she believed it was not over yet. 2 days later, Nora returned to the harbor and approached a man she had known since childhood. His name was Elliot Park, and he had been a friend of Caleb's for decades. He owned a sturdy fishing boat and still went out a few times a week. When she asked for his help getting to the inlet, he hesitated. He said the waters were too volatile, the currents too unpredictable. But Nora was persuasive. She showed him the map, told him about the crate, and reminded him that he had once said Caleb was the best man he had ever known. Elliot relented. They agreed to set out at dawn on Sunday when the tide would be lowest. The journey was rougher than expected. The wind shifted suddenly, and the sea felt hostile. Elliot's face grew grim as he maneuvered through the churning water. Nora held onto the railing, eyes fixed on the cliffs. When they reached the mouth of the inlet, Elliot cut the engine and let the boat drift. From this vantage point, Nora saw something she had never noticed before. A small, weather-beaten buoy bobbed between two outcroppings. It looked too new to belong to the original navigation markers. She pointed it out, and Elliot, reluctant but curious, steered toward it. Beneath the buoy, anchored with the rusted chain, was a large metal canister sealed tight with a rubber ring. With some effort, they hauled it aboard. Nora opened it, her hands trembling. Inside was a waterproof bag containing several Polaroids, all taken in the same location. A cabin nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by tall pine trees and fog. In the bottom of the bag was a matchbook from a roadside diner 3 counties inland. On the inside flap, someone had written a single word, Tuesday. Nora turned the images over and gasped. One had Caleb in it. He was standing near the cabin, his face partly obscured by shadows, but unmistakably him. His clothes looked worn, and his beard was longer, but the expression in his eyes was the same. Nora stared at the photo until the wind nearly ripped it from her hand. Elliot watched her silently, unsure of what to say. He offered to go with her to the cabin, but Nora shook her head. This was something she had to do alone. That night, she studied the photos identifying landmarks and tree patterns. By morning, she had triangulated a rough location. It would take time to get there, and the matchbook suggested urgency. She planned to leave Monday afternoon and reach the area by Tuesday morning. As she packed a small bag, she felt a surge of emotion that had eluded her for years. It was not quite hope, not yet, but it was close. That Sunday night, Nora sat at the kitchen table again, this time with a candle burning beside her. She wrote a letter addressed to no one outlining what she had discovered and where she was going. She left it under Caleb's coat by the back door just in case. She did not know what she expected to find at the cabin. Maybe it was a cruel trick, maybe someone was playing with her heart. But something deep inside her refused to accept that. The map, the buoy, the photographs, they were too specific to be chance. She believed in Caleb. She believed he had left a trail, and now, finally, she was following it. The drive to the mountains was long and winding, lined with trees that grew taller the farther Nora went. She had left just after lunch, the road still dry under a pale autumn sun. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, not from fear, but from focus. The photographs were folded inside her jacket within reach on the passenger seat. Each curve in the road reminded her of summers she and Caleb had spent camping years before routines had replaced spontaneity. She watched for landmarks, old wooden signs, a rusted water tower, a dilapidated barn half swallowed by vines. Each one brought her closer to the forested stretch she had marked on the map, closer to a place where Caleb had once stood, not yet lost to the sea or time. As dusk approached, Nora reached the edge of the forest. She parked on a gravel patch just off a forgotten logging road and slipped on her hiking boots. The air was colder here, and the silence deeper. She adjusted her backpack and locked the car, then began the hike uphill, following a narrow trail that disappeared beneath pine needles and fallen branches. The trees were dense, and the fading light turned the woods into a maze of shadows. She kept her eyes forward, moving steadily. An hour passed before she saw a clearing ahead, just visible through the trees. Her breath caught. The cabin was real. It sat low to the ground, its roof moss-covered and porch sagging, but it matched the photograph exactly. Nora stepped cautiously into the clearing, her boots crunching over dead leaves. The cabin door was slightly ajar, as though left that way deliberately. She paused, listening. There were no voices, no sounds of life, only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of dust and pine. A cot with a wool blanket sat in one corner, a small stove in another. A wooden table held a stack of papers weighed down by a rock. Nora reached for them and saw her name written on the top sheet in Caleb's handwriting. She sat down slowly, her heart pounding, and began to read. The letter was dated 5 years after his disappearance. It was brief but clear. Caleb explained he had left because he had uncovered something dangerous, something that would have put Nora at risk. He wrote of people watching him, following him, and a decision to disappear before they came closer to home. He had used the inlet to reach this cabin, which belonged to a distant friend of his brother's. There were no details about the threat itself, only mentions of surveillance, intercepted messages, and a fear that he could not explain on paper. He ended the letter by saying he never stopped thinking of her, never stopped hoping she would find the trail he had left behind. Nora read the letter twice before setting it down. She looked around the room and noticed more signs of occupation. A pair of boots beneath the cot, a tin of tea beside the stove, a faded photo of her and Caleb taped to the inside wall. He had lived here maybe for years. She stood and examined the shelves, finding old canned goods, a flashlight, and a compass. In the small drawer beneath the table, she found a second letter, this one in a different handwriting. It was addressed to Caleb and signed by someone named Russell. Her stomach turned. Russell was Caleb's older brother, presumed dead in a fire more than 30 years ago. The letter was undated but written in haste. Russell warned Caleb not to return to the harbor. He said the situation had changed, that someone knew about the cabin. He insisted Caleb leave the area immediately and meet him at a safe location further inland. Coordinates were scribbled at the bottom of the page along with a single line that made Nora's skin prickle. Do not trust anyone from the harbor, even those you think you know. She'd folded the letter carefully and put it in her jacket. Her legs felt heavy as she moved toward the doorway. Outside, the forest was growing darker, the trees now tall silhouettes against a gray sky. Nora decided to spend the night in the cabin. She lit a candle from her pack and placed it on the table. The flame cast a warm glow on the wood-paneled walls. She ate a sandwich in silence and lay on the cot, Caleb's blanket pulled over her legs. Sleep came slowly. Her dreams were fractured and filled with voices she could not see. When she woke, the sun was beginning to rise. She stepped outside into the morning chill and stood still, listening. In the distance, something moved. A figure, perhaps just beyond the tree line. It disappeared before she could make out any detail. She waited, breath held, but the forest returned to stillness. She returned inside, packed her things, and took one last look at the cabin. Before leaving, she tore a page from her notebook and left a message on the table. If Caleb returned, she wanted him to know she had been there. Then she began the hike back, the photograph of the coordinates folded in her coat. The trail felt different in daylight, less mysterious, but no less solemn. When she reached the car, she slid behind the wheel and stared at the road ahead. She had no proof that Caleb was still alive, but she had seen the cabin, the letter, and the warnings. Someone else had been part of this, and if Russell was truly alive, then the fire from decades ago was not the end of that story. Nora drove back into Crescent Bay by late afternoon, the ocean visible once again in her rearview mirror. She passed the harbor but did not stop. Instead, she drove to the library and requested old newspaper archives from 1987, the year Russell supposedly died. The librarian, an older man with kind eyes, helped her locate the microfilm reels. She spent the next 3 hours reading every article. When she found the fire report, her breath caught. It stated that 2 bodies were presumed dead, but only one had been conclusively identified. The other was too badly burned. The case had been closed, the funeral held, but the name of the second person had never been confirmed. The days that followed Nora's discovery at the cabin moved slowly. She had taken time off from the cafe where she worked mornings, claiming a family matter, though no one pressed her for details. People in Crescent Bay had learned over the years not to question Nora too closely. She carried herself with quiet resolve, and her grief, though private, felt sacred. She spent her time between the library and her kitchen table, piecing together clippings, notes, and photographs like assembling a jigsaw puzzle whose final image remained stubbornly hidden. The letter from Russell changed everything. The coordinates, scribbled at the bottom, pointed to an area near a long-closed sawmill an hour inland, a place once buzzing with trucks and noise, now silent and reclaimed by weeds. Nora planned to visit it, but something else pulled her attention first. That Thursday morning, while walking through the market square, she saw a man who made her stop in her tracks. He stood in the shadow of a florist's awning, looking over crates of late-blooming chrysanthemums. His coat was gray, well-worn, and his hat obscured part of his face. But there was something about the way he moved, the curve of his shoulders, the shape of his hands. Nora could not look away. When he turned slightly, her breath caught. It was not Caleb, but he looked so much like Russell that, for a moment, she felt the air thicken around her. She stepped closer, weaving through the morning crowd. The man glanced up briefly, his eyes brushing past her like wind through reeds. She followed him for several blocks, but he disappeared into a side alley near the harbor's edge where the old shipyard buildings cast deep shadows. When she reached the alley, he was gone. That evening, Nora returned to the alley, retracing her steps from earlier. It was narrow and dark, the kind of place people passed by without noticing. Halfway down, she found something wedged between two rusted pipes. It was a torn piece of newspaper folded carefully around a photo. She peeled it open with trembling hands. The photo was an old one, slightly faded. Caleb stood beside a docked boat, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy Nora did not recognize. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date and a word April the 1985 Watchtower. The name meant nothing to her, but the date was 2 years before Caleb and Russell lost touch. She tucked the photo into her coat and walked home in the falling dusk. The next day, Nora asked around about the man she had seen. Most vendors claimed they had not noticed him. One, a woman who sold handmade scarves, said she might have seen him near the ferry terminal 2 weeks ago. He had asked for directions to Westford, a small town with a population of barely 600. Nora made note of it and returned to the library. She dug through the archived maps and found that Westford sat near the edge of an old state park and bordered the property once owned by the sawmill company. The dots began to connect, but the picture was still unclear. On Sunday, Nora drove to Westford. The road twisted through hills and valleys, the foliage turning brilliant shades of red and gold. It was a quiet town with a single diner, a gas station, and a few houses set back from the road. She parked beside the diner and walked through the town on foot. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. As she neared the edge of town, a small general store caught her eye. Inside, a young man greeted her with a nod. Nora asked if anyone matching the man's description had come through recently. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. He said a man had bought supplies about a week ago, paid in cash, and kept to himself. He mentioned that the man had asked about the abandoned sawmill trail which started just beyond the ridge. Nora thanked him and followed the path out of town. The trail was overgrown but still visible. She walked for nearly an hour, passing old fence posts and rusted machinery overtaken by time. At the edge of a clearing stood what remained of the sawmill. Its walls were mostly collapsed, and vines crawled over the charred beams. Near the back of the structure, she found a small structure that looked like it had been added long after the main building had shut down. Its door was slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. There was a cot, a lantern, and a crate filled with canned food. On the wall, someone had scratched numbers into the wood like a calendar. Nora stepped closer and noticed a familiar name etched near the bottom. Foster. Her heart pounded. Caleb had been here, or maybe Russell, or both. She found a worn backpack beneath the cot. Inside were clothes, a map, and a weathered notebook. The first few pages were blank, but deeper in she found sketches and names. Caleb's name appeared several times along with the word Watchtower, again underlined in red. There was also a list of coordinates and dates, none of which meant anything to her. But one entry, written in a different ink, stood out. It read, "We cannot stay here anymore. They know. I left the ring and the page like we planned. Pray she finds it." Below that was a small symbol Nora had never seen before, like a crescent inside a triangle. Nora copied everything she could into her own notebook and took photos of the cabin interior. She left the site quietly, not touching anything else. As she walked back toward Westford, she replayed the timeline in her mind. If Russell had survived the fire, he had likely gone underground. If Caleb had joined him, then everything they had done since the map, the journal, the buoy, had been deliberate. They had been communicating through hidden places, leaving trails in places no one thought to look. She wondered what Watchtower meant, and whether it was a person, a place, or something else entirely. When Nora returned to Crescent Bay that evening, she pulled into her driveway and found something that made her pause. On her porch sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. There was no return address, only her name in neat, slanted handwriting. Inside was a ring. It was Caleb's wedding band. Alongside it was a folded note with a single sentence, "I did what I had to do. Forgive me." The package on the porch unsettled Nora in a way she could not fully explain. She had held the ring for nearly 20 minutes before taking it inside, letting its weight press into her palm. The band was unmistakably Caleb's, the inscription inside still visible, worn by years of wear but intact. To Nora, it felt like proof and loss intertwined. She placed it gently on the table beside the folded note and sat in silence. The message was short, written in a steady hand. Caleb had signed it with his initials, a small C etched beside the final line. It was the first direct contact she had received from him in more than 2 decades. She reread the line, "I did what I had to do. Forgive me," until the words blurred. Forgiveness was a complicated thing when answers remained out of reach. That night, Nora slept restlessly, her mind caught between memory and speculation. She woke early and walked to the harbor while the town was still quiet. The sea was calm, a soft mist curling over the water. The docks were empty except for a few gulls resting on the pilings. She sat on the bench where Caleb used to wait for his fishing partner every morning. The wind carried a familiar scent, a mix of salt and old wood. As the sky lightened, she noticed a figure approaching from the far side of the harbor. It was the same man she had seen near the market. His steps were slow, deliberate. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench without speaking. They sat in silence for several minutes, the space between them filled only by the sound of lapping water. Eventually, he turned slightly toward her, revealing a profile she had studied in old photographs. The resemblance to Russell was undeniable. His face was age-scarred along the jawline and partially obscured by a beard. He looked at Nora with tired eyes and nodded once. She did not speak first. It was as if the air itself held the weight of what needed to be said. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and worn. He told her that he knew she had been to the cabin and the sawmill. He said he had left the ring because Caleb had asked him to if anything ever happened. And then he handed her a small envelope from his coat pocket and stood to leave. Nora called out to him, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked if Caleb was alive. He paused, but did not turn around. After a moment, he shook his head slowly and walked away, disappearing down the path behind the old marina building. Nora sat frozen, the envelope clenched in her hand. When she finally opened it, she found a second photograph and a page torn from a journal. The photograph showed a man who looked like Caleb standing beside a chain-link fence, his hand resting on a wooden post. The fence was marked with a sign that read "Restricted Area." The journal page was in Caleb's handwriting. He described a facility inland near the edge of the county and warned that it was no longer safe. He wrote that he had stayed behind to keep something from leaving, though he never explained what that was. Later that afternoon, Nora returned home and spread out everything she had collected across the dining table. Photographs, maps, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings covered the surface. She cross-referenced the coordinates from the journal with maps until she located the area described. It was land that had once been owned by the government, later transferred to a private research firm. Locals referred to it as the Ridge Complex. The site had been inactive for years, its gates locked the buildings left to decay, but the fences were still intact and signs still warned against trespassing. Nora circled the location and made plans to visit it the following day. The next morning, Nora drove out past the county line. The road to the Ridge Complex was poorly maintained and overgrown. At the gate, she parked and climbed the embankment, careful to avoid drawing attention. The facility was larger than she expected. Low buildings sat scattered behind the fences, their windows boarded up. She walked the perimeter until she found a break in the wire and slipped through. The silence of the place pressed down on her. Every step echoed off the cracked pavement. She found a side entrance to one of the buildings and entered. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, some overturned papers scattered across the floor. Nora moved cautiously, searching for anything familiar. In one room, she found a bulletin board filled with photographs and notes. One of the photographs had Caleb in it, standing beside two men in uniform. Another showed the same fenced yard as the photo Russell had given her. She took them down, folded them, and placed them in her bag. In a locked drawer, she found a list of names, most of them unfamiliar. But near the bottom, she found Russell Foster marked inactive, and beside it, Caleb Foster's status unknown. She stared at the words, unsure what they meant. What had this place been, and why were their names on a personnel list? She left the facility as the sky began to darken. Back at home, she reviewed everything once more. Caleb had worked with Russell after the fire after his supposed death. They had lived in hiding, moving between remote locations. They had been part of something larger, something they had never spoken about. Nora felt the weight of it pressing in. Her grief was not just for a lost husband now, but for a life lived in shadows, for truths left buried. She lit a fire on the hearth and sat in silence, staring at the flickering light. That night she dreamed of the ocean again, but this time Caleb was not lost. He stood at the edge of the dock, watching her with calm eyes. He did not speak, but he looked peaceful. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the ring still clutched in her hand. She did not know if Russell had told the truth. She did not know if Caleb had made it out, but she knew now that he had never abandoned her. He had chosen a path that kept her safe. He had left behind a trail, however fragile, and she had followed it. 2 days after her visit to the Ridge complex, Nora returned to the harbor and sat again on the bench where she had seen Russell. The air smelled of wet rope and diesel from the boats coming in with their catch. Her fingers traced the edge of Caleb's ring now hanging from a chain around her neck. She watched the waves slap against the dock pylons and felt the familiar tug of memory. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many shadows clinging to Caleb's past. She needed more than photographs and warnings. She needed a voice to explain what had happened behind the walls of that forgotten facility. She remembered what Russell had said, that Caleb had stayed behind to protect something. It was a sentence that would not leave her. The following morning, she began making calls. She started with public records. Most of the people associated with the Ridge complex had vanished from view, retired, or relocated with no trace. After 2 hours of searching, Nora found a name that stood out. Thomas Greeley. He had worked as a security supervisor at the complex in the early 90s and had retired in a nearby town. A local directory listed his address as a part of a senior apartment complex not far from the coast. She called the front office and left a message asking to speak with him. She said it was about a former colleague and an old facility. She did not leave her full name. 3 days later, she received a call from a soft-spoken man who identified himself as Greeley. His voice was measured, cautious. Nora told him she had questions about her husband who had worked near the Ridge site. There was a long pause before he asked to meet in person. He said he would feel better talking face to face. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe off the main highway. Nora arrived early, choosing a table near the back away from the window. When he entered, she recognized him from the staff photo she had seen at the complex. He was tall, with gray hair and a heavy build, his posture stooped from years on his feet. He greeted her without shaking hands and sat carefully folding his hands on the table. Nora thanked him for coming. He nodded, but did not speak right away. Finally, he said he remembered Caleb Foster. He remembered him because he was different from the others. Caleb had not been a typical contractor. He had asked too many questions, kept to himself, and stayed longer than most. Greeley said Caleb had been cleared to work on environmental infrastructure, but he quickly learned that the paperwork was a cover. The Ridge complex was not just a research facility, it had been a transfer site. Something had been moved there from another location, and the people who handled it were not regular staff. Nora listened without interrupting. Greeley said that around 1992, a series of nighttime deliveries had begun arriving at the Ridge. The cargo was never labeled, and armed personnel accompanied each truck. Caleb had approached Greeley once asking about a shipment that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. He wanted to know why it had not gone through intake like the others. Greeley said he brushed off the question at the time. But later, he heard that Caleb had been spotted near the west storage wing, which was off-limits. A few weeks after that, Caleb disappeared. Greeley assumed he had been reassigned or had left the project quietly, but then another name resurfaced, one that had long been considered dead. Russell Foster had been seen in the outer perimeter using a contractor's badge that was later flagged as invalid. The facility director ordered a lockdown and began clearing files. Greeley said he was told to shred records and erase certain logs. He had refused and submitted his resignation a month later. He moved to the coast and had not spoken about the ridge since. He told Nora that he believed Caleb had stayed behind to stall something from being moved again, possibly to warn someone. But he never knew what the shipment was, only that it arrived under the highest security he had ever seen. Nora asked him if he had seen Caleb after he left the ridge. Greeley said he had not. But one night in 1996 he had received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the ridge's south fence, and behind it 2 figures standing side by side. One of them looked like Caleb. The letter contained no message, only the photograph. He had kept it in a locked box ever since. He told Nora she could have it if she wanted. She nodded. He reached into his coat and handed her an envelope. Then he stood to leave. Nora thanked him again and sat quietly after he left, holding the envelope in her lap. When she opened it, the photo showed the chain-link fence behind which a man stood with his head turned slightly. The figure beside him was taller and wore a long coat. The man on the left, partially obscured by the glare of a nearby floodlight, looked almost exactly like Caleb. She studied the background. There was a tower in the distance, partially hidden by fog. She had not seen that structure during her visit. It was not marked on the facility's map. Back home, Nora placed the photo with the others. She began sketching out a new map, placing the tower in relation to where she had entered. The pattern became clearer. Caleb had used familiar places to hide pieces of the truth. The cabin, the buoy, the ring, and now this photo. He had chosen specific breadcrumbs, and each one carried risk, but he had left them anyway. As she pieced them together, she began to understand. He had not just disappeared. He had retreated behind a veil of necessity, caught in something larger than either of them had imagined. His love had not ended with distance or time. It had embedded itself in every risk he had taken to shield her from what he could not fully explain. The house Nora had shared with Caleb stood quietly at the edge of Crescent Bay, unchanged in its structure but reshaped by absence. After speaking with Thomas Greeley and reviewing the photograph again, Nora felt a tug, not just toward places unknown, but also toward something closer, something forgotten. She walked through the rooms that night with a flashlight, not searching for anything in particular, but following a sense that there might be more hidden in plain sight. The hallway leading to the attic was narrow, lit only by a thin window high on the wall. Nora had not been in the attic in years. It was where they had stored old fishing gear, Christmas decorations, and boxes of photographs from Caleb's childhood. She climbed the creaky steps slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through layers of dust. The door groaned open, revealing a space packed with time. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air smelled of cedar and mothballs. She moved past the familiar bins and stopped at a wooden trunk she did not remember seeing before. It was tucked behind a stack of broken picture frames. Its metal latch was rusted, but it opened with a firm pull. Inside were 2 thick binders, a roll of nautical maps, and a brown envelope marked only with the year 1994. She pulled everything out and sat cross-legged on the floor, heart steady but alert. The binders contained pages of detailed notes in Caleb's handwriting. They referenced names, dates, and coordinates, many of which matched locations Nora had already visited. Some entries described events she did not understand, with mentions of visitors who arrived without records, people who vanished after short assignments and unexplained lockdowns. One page caught her attention. It described an internal signal Caleb had intercepted originating from a tower referred to as the Watch Point. He had marked the location on a map, but had not labeled it beyond that. Nora placed the binders beside her and opened the envelope next. Inside was a small leather notebook and a folded photo. The notebook was different from the others. It was written in shorter sentences, more personal and less coded. Caleb had used it as a private journal, and it revealed thoughts he had never shared with anyone else. He wrote about the strain of hiding, about fearing every stranger's glance, and about the guilt that weighed on him for leaving Nora behind. He described moments of hesitation and solitude, but also moments of purpose. One entry mentioned that he and Russell had made a plan to leave the ridge entirely, but only if the final transfer could be stopped. The notebook ended abruptly mid-sentence, suggesting it had been hidden in haste. Nora turned to the photograph. It showed Caleb standing near a familiar landmark, the old Crescent Ridge Fire Tower. It was part of the county's emergency infrastructure, long decommissioned, but still standing in the hills north of town. The fencing behind him matched the one in Greeley's photo. Nora traced the tower on a current map and found that it lay within protected woodland. She had hiked there once as a teenager, but had not been back in decades. That same night, she packed a backpack with water, a flashlight, and a copy of the map. She planned to leave at dawn. Morning came with a pale sun and a chill in the air. Nora parked at the trailhead and began the climb toward the tower. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you listen harder. Birds chirped at intervals, but otherwise the world felt still. The trail had faded in parts, overgrown with brambles and moss. Her boots crushed the damp leaves as she moved steadily upward. After an hour, the fire tower came into view. Its silhouette was rusted, but intact, the steps leading to the observation deck partially collapsed. She stood at the base, studying the structure. A faded sign warned of instability, but Nora's focus shifted to a small shack nearby, partially hidden by fallen branches. She approached the shack and tried the door. It opened slowly. Inside was a cot, a small desk, and a broken radio unit. On the desk sat a metal tin covered in dust. She opened it and found a cassette tape labeled in Caleb's handwriting with a single word, "Listen." The shack had no electricity, but she remembered that her neighbor still had an old cassette player. She took the tape, tucked it carefully in her bag, and looked around one last time. There were no fresh signs of anyone living there. Whatever had happened at this place had ended long ago. Back at home, she borrowed the cassette player and sat alone in her living room. When the tape began to play, she heard static first, then Caleb's voice. It was quiet, shaky at first, as if he had been unsure whether it would ever be heard. He spoke about the fire tower and how it had once been a lookout point, not just for forest fires, but for unauthorized aircraft during brief contract operations. He said the facility had received a signal he believed was not from the Coast Guard, but from a contractor with private security interests. Caleb explained that the final transfer was scheduled to move something to an offshore location. He did not name it, but said it would have changed everything for people who never agreed to be involved. He ended the tape with a long pause, then said he had chosen to stay to reroute the final shipment. He believed he had succeeded. He said if the tape had been found, it meant he had not returned, and he hoped she would understand. The tape ended in silence, and Nora sat still for a long time. Her tears came slowly, not from sadness alone, but from a mix of pride and heartbreak. Caleb had never given up. He had left pieces of himself everywhere, and now she had them. 3 days passed after Nora listened to Caleb's voice on the cassette tape. She played it once more, then returned it to its metal tin and locked it in her desk drawer. Something in his tone, especially toward the end, carried not only sorrow, but finality. Still, she could not shake the sense that the story had one more corner left to turn. She kept returning to the name Watchtower and the connection to the final shipment. Each breadcrumb Caleb had left was tied to places of surveillance, secrecy, or escape. That pattern stayed with her. Then, late one evening, a call came from the local sheriff's department. A man had been found near a lake on the outskirts of town, dehydrated and confused. He carried no identification and gave only a partial name when questioned. He had whispered Foster before collapsing. Nora arrived at the small clinic just after sunrise. The nurse recognized her and led her to a room where the man was resting. He was gaunt with gray stubble and sun-darkened skin. His face was unfamiliar, but his eyes were sharp, cautious, and restless. He looked at Nora without recognition at first, then blinked as if trying to place a memory. The nurse explained that he had not spoken clearly since he arrived, but had mentioned Crescent Bay the Ridge and something about a second lockbox. Nora stepped closer and spoke softly, asking if he knew Caleb. The man nodded slowly and said one name under his breath. Russell. Nora sat beside the bed and listened as the man began to speak more clearly. He said his name was Gerald Minton, a contractor who had worked indirectly with the Ridge facility under a subcontract agreement. He had been stationed at a satellite operation not far from the lake where he was found. He claimed he had kept quiet for years out of fear, but something had changed recently. A group that had once been monitoring former Ridge personnel had gone silent. He had tried to reach Russell several times, but the last message bounced back. He feared the others were gone or had been silenced. He said he had walked for days after a power failure at his cabin and had come to Crescent Bay because he remembered Caleb had family here. Nora asked him about the second lockbox. Gerald said Russell had once kept a backup cache near the base of a waterfall that fed into the lake. It had been used for emergency drops during the years they were in hiding. If the box still existed, it might contain records of the final movement, and perhaps proof of what the Ridge transfer had involved. He warned that the trail to the waterfall was narrow and dangerous, especially after recent rain. Nora made notes as he spoke, drawing a rough map based on his memory. The sheriff, having confirmed the man's condition was stable, allowed Nora to speak with him again the next day. Early the following morning, Nora packed her bag with supplies and set off toward the lake. The drive was long and winding, the trees dense on either side. When she arrived at the ranger station near the trailhead, she checked in and explained she was hiking to photograph the falls. The ranger gave her a map and wished her luck. The path was muddy and slick in places, but Nora pressed forward. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step. After nearly 2 hours, she reached the edge of the falls. The water tumbled over jagged rocks, crashing into a pool below. The spray dampened her clothes as she moved cautiously down a narrow incline toward a small overhang. Beneath the rocky ledge, tucked inside a crevice just above the waterline, Nora saw something out of place. A rusted metal box covered in moss and wedged tightly into the rock. She pulled it free and carried it to a dry spot on the bank. The lock had corroded, but after several attempts she managed to pry it open. Inside were plastic-wrapped documents, photographs, and a small audio recorder. The contents were still dry. She scanned the documents first. They listed transport routes, vehicle identification numbers, and names she recognized from previous files. One document stood out. It was a signed manifest listing an outbound transfer from Ridge dated May 1994, but the contents were blacked out. Another page included hand-drawn maps of the Ridge complex and the fire tower, each marked with red circles. Nora sat on a flat stone and played the audio recorder. A voice she recognized as Russell spoke in a measured tone. He said the shipment had included surveillance modules and data extraction equipment, possibly experimental. He believed the program had been designed not just to collect information, but to manipulate it. He mentioned that Caleb had disabled part of the transfer by rerouting the grid from inside the Ridge tower. Russell's last message stated that he planned to disappear after leaving the lockbox, but that if someone found it, they should know they had been warned for years, and no one had listened. The message ended abruptly with the sound of wind and water. Nora remained by the falls until the sun began to lower in the sky. She packed the documents carefully and hiked back in silence. Her thoughts moved slowly, not in confusion, but in weight. Caleb and Russell had seen something dangerous and had given up everything to contain it. They had used every skill they had to bury what could not be explained. And in doing so, they had become ghosts in their own story. Back in town, she returned the documents to her home and made digital copies, storing them securely. She placed the original items in the same trunk she had found in the attic and sealed it again. That night, she stood on the back porch and watched the tide move in. The stars shimmered faintly above the bay, and the wind rustled through the reeds. She did not know if Russell was still alive or if Gerald would recover fully, but she knew now what Caleb had been protecting. She knew he had trusted her to follow the path only when it was safe enough. And she had. Not just because she missed him, but because she believed in the quiet kind of love that leaves signs instead of words. 2 weeks passed in quiet rhythm after Nora returned from the lake. The documents from the lockbox were now safely stored, their digital backups encrypted and secured. She had taken to rising early, walking the shore each morning before opening her notebook and sorting through what she had learned. The evidence no longer raised new questions. It clarified what had always been uncertain. Caleb and Russell had made a decision to erase themselves from public life in order to protect others from something that had gone wrong. Nora had accepted that truth. What she had not expected was for it to reach back out to her. It was a Wednesday morning when the letter arrived. It had no return address and was postmarked from a neighboring city. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. The sender identified himself as a freelance journalist working on a series about decommissioned government facilities and whistleblowers who had vanished after exposure. He claimed to have come across information that aligned with Nora's late husband's disappearance. He requested a meeting, stating he had no intention to publish anything without consent, but believed she might be able to confirm details that had recently surfaced. The message was polite, respectful, and cautious in tone. Nora read it 3 times before placing it down. She spent the rest of the day researching the journalist. His name was Lewis Hart. She'd searched online databases and newspaper archives. His bylines appeared in several investigative pieces, mostly involving infrastructure fraud and cases involving government cover-ups. His work had a steady tone and lacked sensationalism. Nora noted that in every article she found the subjects were treated with care. Victims were not exploited, and sources were not misquoted. Still, the idea of speaking openly about what she had discovered unsettled her. She knew the danger had passed, but part of her felt that some truths were meant to remain heavy in silence. That night, she sat at her desk and wrote a response. She agreed to meet him at the library in Crescent Bay, a public place she trusted. The following Monday, Lewis arrived on time. He was younger than she expected, in his early 40s, with a quiet demeanor and soft-spoken words. He introduced himself and thanked her for agreeing to meet. Nora led him to a table near the window where the light filtered through old glass in soft angles. She asked him what had brought him to her door. He explained that during a record search for a different project, he had come across an internal memo referencing 2 men who had disappeared after a ridge-related transport delay in the early 90s. One of the names was redacted, but the second had remained visible, Caleb Foster. He said he had followed that name and had found obituaries, news clippings, and mentions in old naval logs, but something about the timeline did not align. He said that when he cross-referenced sightings and movement reports, he found gaps that suggested someone had deliberately removed key details from the records. He had spoken to a former maintenance technician who remembered a man being escorted through the Ridge facility under heavy guard weeks after the project supposedly ended. That man had matched Caleb's description. Lewis had followed the trail to Crescent Bay and had found Nora's name on an old employee list from the harbor. Nora listened without interrupting. She asked him what he wanted to do with the information. Lewis said he wanted to understand. He said the story was bigger than a single article. It was about a pattern of concealment, about how people in ordinary roles were drawn into things they never intended to be part of. He assured her again that he would not publish anything she did not agree to. He only wanted to know what she knew. Nora looked at him for a long time before she reached into her bag and removed a photograph. It was the image of Caleb near the fire tower. She placed it on the table between them. She began with the boat. She told him about the emergency beacon, about Buster's return, and about the map she had found in the harbor locker. She walked him through the trip to the cabin, the encounter with Russell, and the discoveries at the sawmill and Ridge complex. She described the tape, the lockbox near the lake, and the documents she had recovered. Lewis took notes but did not record. He nodded slowly, asking only small, clarifying questions. After an hour, he leaned back and said that what she had gathered could shift the narrative around Ridge entirely. He said she had preserved something important not only for her own closure but for public record. Nora asked him if he believed it should be made public. Lewis was silent for a long moment. Then he said he believed people deserved to know what had happened, but only if those closest to the story were ready to share it. He said that, in his experience, most of the people who had been silenced had not been hiding shame. They had been carrying the weight of other people's decisions. He told her that what Caleb and Russell had done sounded like the actions of men who believed deeply in doing the right thing, even if it meant disappearing. Nora felt something shift inside her at his words. When they parted, she gave Lewis a printed copy of the Ridge Manifest and one of the maps. She told him to wait 2 weeks before making any decision. He agreed and thanked her again. As he walked away, Nora stood by the library steps and watched him blend into the quiet bustle of town. She felt no regret. For the first time in years, she felt that Caleb's voice might continue through another, not in headlines but in careful hands. The first real rain of the season came 3 days after Nora's meeting with Lewis. It started slow, the kind of drizzle that softened the edges of rooftops and made the streets glisten beneath street lamps. By nightfall, it had turned steady and cold. The sound filled the house like a hum, drumming lightly against the windows and making the old floorboards creak just a little louder. Nora sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside her, the ring on its chain resting against the hollow of her throat. Her eyes scanned the photographs spread out before her for what felt like the 100th time, though she no longer searched for clues. She looked now with recognition. The kind that comes after the storm has passed, when the broken pieces are no longer sharp but worn and familiar. That night, she dreamt of the dock again. Caleb stood just beyond the edge of the pier, wearing the same jacket he had left in the hall closet all those years ago. He did not wave or speak. He only looked at her with calm eyes, like he was waiting for her to understand something she had not before. She woke just before dawn, the sky still dark, but the rain beginning to slow. She did not rush to rise. Instead, she stayed in bed a few minutes longer, the silence inside the house steadying her breath. Later that morning, she opened her laptop and wrote a letter. It was not for Lewis, nor for anyone in particular. It was for Caleb. She wrote about the years she had spent believing he was lost. She wrote about the ache of mornings when his boots were not by the door, the quietness of the bedroom when she turned toward his side and found only a folded blanket. She wrote about how she had hated the sea for a while, then missed it too deeply to stay angry. She wrote that she now understood. Not every decision could be explained with a neat sentence. Some choices were born from the instinct to protect, to love so deeply that leaving became the only way to keep someone safe. When she finished the letter, she printed a single copy and folded it into a plain envelope. She placed it with the other items in the trunk. Then she walked outside and stood on the porch, the smell of wet earth rising through the mist. The street was quiet, the clouds lifting slowly from the rooftops. She thought about the conversations that would soon follow the ones Lewis would have with editors or historians or anyone else who might be ready to hear the story she had uncovered. She trusted him to be careful. She trusted herself not to flinch from the truth anymore. Later that week, she received a letter from Gerald Minton's sister. Gerald had passed away in his sleep 2 nights earlier. The note was short, but it thanked Nora for visiting him and for treating him with dignity in his final days. The words were kind and unexpected. Nora folded the note and placed it inside the back cover of Caleb's journal. She thought of Gerald, wandering the woods to find her holding on to the last pieces of a past he had tried so long to outrun. She hoped that in the end he had known peace. In the months that followed, Lewis published a carefully constructed piece. It did not name Nora directly, nor did it mention Crescent Bay. It focused instead on a pattern of activity surrounding the Ridge facility and on the story of 2 unnamed brothers who had vanished after attempting to intervene in a covert operation. The article included fragments of the manifest, blurred photographs, and portions of the recorded messages Russell had left behind. Public reaction was subdued but curious. A few former staff came forward with corroborating accounts. No new investigation was launched, but the silence that had surrounded Ridge finally began to lift. For Nora, the article was not closure, but it was confirmation. She had not imagined it all. She had not invented meaning from grief. What Caleb and Russell had done had mattered, even if most people would never know the full scope of it. She began to walk to the harbor more often, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes late in the day when the sky turned orange behind the boats. She would sit on the bench near the water and listen to the tide pulling at the pilings. People passed her without pause, and that felt right. Her story, for once, could remain still. One afternoon in early spring, a boy came to her door holding a clipboard. He was part of a youth oral history project through the local high school. He asked if she might be willing to share something about Crescent Bay's past for their archive. She almost said no, but then she saw the earnestness in his expression, the way he held his pen like it might capture more than words. She invited him in and sat him down at the table where so many questions had once begun. She did not tell him everything, only the parts that belonged to the town, the way the harbor used to smell in the summer, the way the fishermen used to sing under their breath when they cleaned their nets, the way loss does not leave in a rush but in the quiet moments that follow a laugh. When he left, she watched him disappear down the path with his backpack bouncing against his side. She smiled just a little, then turned back inside. The house felt lighter somehow. Not emptier, just more lived in. She boiled water for tea and placed another log on the fire. The photo of Caleb remained on the mantel beside the small seashell they had once picked up on their last trip together. She had almost thrown it away once. Now it sat in a glass jar with sand from the beach. That night she walked out to the edge of the dock. The wind was gentle, the stars just beginning to blink into view. She took the ring from her neck and held it in her palm. She did not throw it into the water. She pressed it against her chest, then slipped it back onto the chain. Some things were meant to be carried, not as burdens, but as reminders. She sat at the end of the dock and waited until the tide changed direction. She had read once that when the sea shifts, it pulls things in or sets them free. The moon rose above the ridge, casting silver over the water. She thought of Caleb, of Russell, of all the people who had left pieces of themselves behind in quiet corners of the world. She thought of the people who never knew their names, but benefited from their choices. She closed her eyes and whispered into the wind not a farewell, but a thank you. For the love that had not vanished, for the story that had waited patiently to be heard, and for the man who had left the truth hidden in the tide. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more true, inspired mysteries. We would love to hear what you think about the plot and where you're watching from, so drop a comment below and join the conversation.